All right, good morning, everybody. If we would be so kind as to turn off our cell phones, I would greatly appreciate that as always. Well, today is a very important day at Auburn University. Indeed, this is Tiger Giving Day, so there's a lot of great projects that people are trying to achieve and need some financing. Of course, closest to my heart is always going to be Ollie. And Ollie, of course, is looking for financing so they can enhance our capabilities, perhaps for technology, particularly Zoom classes, so that we can bring more classes to people via Zoom and have better technology in order to achieve that. So I would ask you all to at least consider making a donation and supporting the university in that regard. So with that, that's what I wanted to start with. So. Well, today we're looking at, once again, the Asia-Pacific War, and this is session 12, and I refer to this one as Desperation, the Japanese Offensives on the Asian Continent in 1944. And certainly, we're going to take a little bit back. We need to start a little bit before 44 to really kind of grasp what's going on at this point, I think. And we need to look at this, and what the Japanese goal was in World War II, their big goal was to create a thing they call the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. That is to be included really with, I always talk about the Southern Resource Area, which is obviously Indonesia, as we know today, and Malaysia, and areas where they could get a lot of natural resources. But indeed, their overall view was to create this Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And the idea of that was simply that Asia should be controlled by Asians, not by the imperialist West. So it's the big goal. And when we look at their thinking, if you look at the map, the idea was between the Axis powers that this is how the result of World War II would be. So they would use the 70 East line, and everything to the west of that line would be the sphere of influence of Germany and Italy. Everything to the east of that line would be the sphere of influence for the Japanese. So we see the Japanese and the Germans had really decided how they were going to end World War II with this being their division of how that's going to be accomplished. Well, of course, they don't accomplish that, but indeed, that's what the vision was. Well, even before the Japanese got involved with the United States and Great Britain in World War II, they realized that they were going to have some issues with trying to create this Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And that was going to be this from a gentleman named Kaya. And he stated this in 41 before the war with us. And he says, it will not be possible for some time to give much consideration to the living conditions of the people of the occupied territories. We will have to pursue a so-called policy of exploitation. So they realized up front that they were going to need to extract as much resources from these people as they could in order to try to defeat the United States and Great Britain. This is actually going to be a problem for them later on in the war, because they're going to have two separate goals here, which we'll see. But indeed, by extracting wealth from these countries and basically treating them as occupied territories and being relatively harsh, as we will see, that's going to not be something that's going to help them achieve their overall goal of creating this Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, believe me. So that's a major problem for the Japanese going forward, because they're going to start with a problem with being aggressive against these people, but then they're going to try to enlist them, as we'll see in this lecture. And a key piece of this was found in this. It's called An Investigation of Global Policy with the Yamato Race as Nucleus. And this was a document created by the Japanese government, a part of the Japanese government, in 1943. And this document goes on to show how they view how the war should end up, and indeed their position in the war. And this document was discovered by a historian, a part of it anyway, was discovered by a historian in a Japanese bookstore, used bookstore. And he finds this thing, and they're like, whoa. And so now they begin to look very, very hard to find the rest of it. And actually, they do manage to find a copy of this thing. There were only about 300 copies ever made. And that really comes out of Dower's book, War Without Mercy. But Dower says this from this document is, just as a family has harmony and reciprocity, but with a clear-cut hierarchy, the Japanese, as a purportedly racially superior people, were destined to rule Asia eternally as the head of a family of Asian nations. So they see themselves as, and we've talked about this in some of my other classes, as progenitors of humanity in some senses, but in this regard, they're looking at themselves as being the head of Asian nations. And their policy is going to be significantly different than the Germans. So when we look at Germany and the concept of Lebensraum in Poland and in Ukraine, what they were going to do is they were going to have ethnic cleansing. They were going to drive or exploit or do whatever to the people that lived in those areas so they could create this Aryan land of basically little farming communities, and it was going to be like a German wonderland. The Japanese have a significantly different idea than that. It's not nearly as aggressive as total ethnic cleansing. Their thinking is simply that they're the head of Asian nations. They're going to create this co-prosperity sphere. They're going to be viewed as indeed the leaders, but they are not going to conquer these people. They're going to create a Asia for Asians. So their whole goal is to expel Western imperialists. Their thinking is. Not so sure if that's actually true, but that's what would have been, if it actually would have worked out that way. But that was the thinking, that they would create Asia for the Asians, and it would be, again, a little bit unlike what's going on with the Germans with Lebensraum. Again, it's a Confucian idea. So realistically, I'm not so sure how this would have actually turned out, judging by their behavior in certain areas, but indeed, that's what the idea was for the whole piece here. Well, they're going to have a problem, though, and we've talked about the war, and we're backing up a little bit. We're going back into 1943. So what's going on with the war in 43? Well, in Germany, we of course seen that the Germans have been defeated at Stalingrad. But the Japanese hope that that's not the end of Germany, because there's going to be a major German offensive in 1943 that will result in the famous Battle of Kursk. So the Japanese at this point still think the war isn't, going terribly bad. It's not going how they hoped, but it's not going terribly bad with Germany. In their regards, remember, in the first 6 months of the war, they captured virtually everything they wanted to capture. And of course, at that point, they wanted to have a negotiated peace. Well, as the war goes on, we see that things, again, don't become quite so rosy. For example, they lose 4 carriers at the Battle of Midway, which creates parity between the U.S. and the Japanese Navy as far as air power goes. We see that in the Solomon Islands, the Japanese Navy fights the U.S. in effect to a standstill, but their losses are so bad, they're in a battle of attrition, which the Japanese can never afford. So they've lost equal amounts of ships to the United States, equal amounts of aircraft, but they can't replace those assets, nor can they replace the key personnel that run those assets. So that's another piece. Now, the Japanese army, on the other hand, is another problem. They've lost at Guadalcanal as well. So the Japanese army has been defeated. The Japanese army has been defeated in New Guinea when they try to take Port Moresby. So things aren't going as well as they had initially hoped. But again, I talked to you about 2 lectures ago, I believe, that 1943 was going to be the year of gathering strength. So the Japanese at this time believe that what they can do is they can reconstitute their carrier forces, they can reconstitute their naval air power, and have that battle I talked about called Kentai Kessen, And Kantai-Kessen is simply the huge naval battle that will take place between the United States and Japan, and the Japanese will win that battle, and then we will have a negotiated peace. Doesn't quite work out, actually, but indeed, that's what they're hoping at this time. And we see that their huge defeat in June of 44 at the Battle of the Philippine Seas, or as we like to call it, the Marianas Turkey Shoot. So that's a problem for the Japanese, but that's in the future. Well, the Japanese army has another idea too. They think that what they need to do is they need to win the war on the Asian continent. And if they can win the war on the Asian continent, then indeed we can have this negotiated peace. And much of this is driven by the emperor. The emperor is basically saying, okay, we've got everything we needed in this war. Now we need to end the war, and we need a victory in order to do that. So both groups, the Army and the Navy of Japan, are tasked with different things. The Navy is tasked with defeating the United States at sea. The Army is tasked with defeating the imperialist powers, if we'd like to use that term, on the Asian mainland. And what they're going to do now, because things aren't going quite as well as they had hoped, is they're going to try to enlist Asian nations to assist them in fighting against the imperialist powers. And that's really a key thing that we've seen them do before. And we saw them do this in Malaya, we've seen them do this in Burma, and we've seen them particularly do this in Dutch East Indies. And what that was is before they invaded, they would contact nationalist groups. The nationalist groups would be encouraged to support the Japanese in this goal of greater East Asian co-prosperity, sphere Asia for the Asians. And by enlisting them, they actually provided the Japanese with what is commonly known as a fifth column. And that would be, they would provide information, they would basically spy. They would lead Japanese troops in battle, not in battle, but would lead them and give them directions to get around the British, particularly in Malaya. And so we've seen them do this before. And probably one of the most effective pieces of what they did was in Java, because the Indonesian people really, really were not in favor of Dutch rule. So they were particularly helpful there as well. So again, that's something we've seen them do previously. Well, in order to try to get Asia on their side, even though they've had all this exploitation piece, which is always going to be a problem for them, is they're going to start to create independent Asian nations. And the first one they're going to create is they're going to create Burma on August 1st of 1943. And they declare that Burma will now be independent. It's no longer part of the British Empire, it's its own country. Then they do this same thing to the Philippines. Now, of course, we had promised the Philippines that they would be an independent country on July 4th of 1946. But they're going to attempt to preempt this, and we'll talk more about why shortly. But so they do that. So then they're going to do another thing, which I particularly find interesting, is they're going to create a separate Indian country. They are going to create an India for Indians. And that's the common name is Azad Hind, which means free India. So what they do is they take two little islands that are off the coast of Burma and India, and they declare that this is the recognized government of India, even though they're not in India. So they create their own little Indian country in order to get the Indian people to revolt against the British. And certainly an interesting idea, and we'll see more about how that works. Well, by creating all these new independent anti-Western countries, it's really kind of a propaganda piece, but I love this quote from Toland. He goes, "The West failed to see the significance of these events. The new governments were puppets of Japan, but through them, millions of Asians glimpsed freedom from the white man for the first time." So indeed, this is going to begin a rise of Asian nationalism, and we'll talk a lot about that. Well, so there's going to be this conference. And it's on November 5th and 6th of 1943. And the idea is to enlist the Asian countries to help Japan defeat Western imperialists. And again, this is seen primarily as a propaganda move today, and certainly it was. But again, it's going to help create a future in Asia that we live in today. Well, who's at this conference? And first of all, we have the guy in the middle there. That's Premier Tojo of Japan. He's the leader of this conference. And he's basically, it's running this thing. And then we have a gentleman from the Prime Minister of Manchukuo. Now, you may remember that Manchukuo used to be Manchuria. And when the Japanese captured Manchuria in 31 and 32, they created a new country, which basically is a puppet to Japan. And this gentleman is the leader of that. But the head of state for that country is actually the last emperor of China, Puyi. So you see, they try to get some legitimacy for this new country of Manchukuo, even as early as 1932. Well, the next piece we have Wang Jingwei, who we've talked about previously. And you may remember that Wang was closely associated with Sun Yat-sen. He felt, and many people thought, that he was going to be the leader of the nationalist government in China when indeed Sun Yat-sen died. That doesn't work out for him, of course, because Chiang Kai-shek becomes the leader of the nationalist government in China. But he's a major player in China. He's a key part of Chiang's government. And when the Japanese and the Chinese go to war in 1937, a direct confrontation, things, of course, aren't going particularly well for the Chinese. And the war is getting more and more terrible. And Jingwei, he decides that what needs to happen is they need to end the war. And he defects from the nationalist government and goes and meets with the Japanese and tries to create a new government. This doesn't go particularly as well as he had hoped either, but eventually he is declared as the legitimate government of China, of course, under Japanese control. And he sets up his new capital in Anqing, the former capital of the nationalists. So he is viewed by some Chinese as indeed the legitimate ruler of China, even though he's a puppet to Japan. Well, then we have Burma. He is the head of state and head of government for Burma, which has now become an independent country. So we will talk a little bit about Burma. He's a key politician previously to the Japanese invasion into Burma. He's certainly a Burmese nationalist. And so he's going to be there. And then we have a character, Subhas Chandra Bose, and he is the head of state for that new independent India, the two little islands. And we will talk in much more detail about Mr. Bose shortly. Then we have Jose P. Laurel. He is the provisional government of the Philippines. Again, we will talk about him in great detail shortly. And lastly, in this group, we have an envoy from Thailand. And the envoy is part of the royal family. Now, why is the premier of Thailand not there? Well, he sees Thailand as already been an independent country. So he doesn't see that they need necessarily to be that associated with the Japanese as far as throwing off the yoke of the imperialist whites. That's part of it. The second part of it, of course, is that he's actually afraid that if he leaves the country, he's going to get overthrown. And the reason of that is there's a strong group of Thais that really don't want to be associated with the Japanese, particularly the Thai Air Force. And that's a problem. So he's actually, I can't leave town because I'll lose my job. So he doesn't want to go there. Well, I think what's really different is there's someone here that's not here that probably should be here. And that is, of course, Sukarno from what will become Indonesia. He's not invited. And we'll talk in a lot more detail next week about why he is not invited to this conference. But again, you got to realize that Sukarno will be the command of India, will be the head of Indonesia all the way into the early 60s. And he's not invited. So that's a key piece here. Well, when we look at this conference, it becomes more and more and more passionate with this idea of Asian nationalism. Certainly they become more and more involved with a thing called Pan-Asianism. And Pan-Asianism is something that the Japanese have used from day one, including in their invasion of China. And the idea is simply this: that China, of course, is not an independent country. It's basically just controlled by white imperialists. So since it's not a legitimate country, it's not an independent country, the Japanese have invaded China to liberate them from this problem. Chinese don't necessarily see it that way. They tend to think that the Japanese are just another imperialist invader, but regardless, that's what the Japanese are saying. And we've talked a little bit about this before, but it's very, very important in this regard today, because the Japanese see that any war that is authorized by the emperor, this divine person, is a just war. And of course, anyone that goes against that is basically being a criminal. And because of that, they see this as something they need to do. And they have a agreement, and Bix actually mentions this in his nice book. He goes, the Japanese refer to something as compassionate killing. Well, when we look at compassionate killing, why is this something the Japanese believe in? Well, of course, anybody that's opposing the emperor, who's this divine person, is doing, first, that's wrong. You can't go against the emperor. And second of all, they want to free Asian people. So the Chinese government is viewed, of course, as being a tool of the imperialist West. And so anybody that stands in their way is a bad person and deserves to be killed. And it's not like they want to kill him. We don't want to kill you, but we have to. So it's a strange concept to us. Yes.
Has anybody else ever used that rationale for a war, or that you know of?
I'm sure it has been. I get off the top of my head, but certainly we've seen a lot of religious wars that probably go right in that regard, but I don't want to go down that road today. So, but anyway, they have this idea of compassionate killing. So we're doing this for the good of Asia. We're not doing this for our own benefit. Okay. So you can take that however you want. Well, Burma, now again, they're getting really impassioned with this thing. They're getting really fired up about this whole idea of Pan-Asianism and Asia for the Asians. And Burma, there's a lot of speeches in here. I could go on for decades, but I won't. I'll just use this one because I really think it's one of the best. He goes, in the past, which now seems to be long ago, it was inconceivable that the Asia people should meet together as we are meeting here today. Well, the impossible has happened. It has happened in a way which outstrips the boldest fantasy or dreams of the boldest dreamer among us. From every point of view, East Asia is a world in itself. We Asiatics forgot this fact for long centuries and paid heavily for it. For as a result, Asiatics lost Asia. Now that we have once more, thanks to Japan, recaptured this truth and acted upon it, the Asiatics shall certainly recover Asia. Let's examine that a little bit. First of all, they're giving credit to the Japanese for this amazing turn of events, freeing them from Western imperialists. And why do they look at Japan this way? And there's a lot of key reasons. First of all, the Japanese are an independent Asian country. The Japanese are the only Asian country that's completely industrialized and has a major military. The Japanese managed to defeat a Western power in 1905 when they defeat the Russians. The Japanese again defeat the Germans, along with the Allies, of course, in 1914 to 1918 in World War I. And most recently, they have driven the British out of Malaya, Singapore, and Burma, and the Dutch out of the Dutch East Indies. So indeed, the Japanese have a lot of what I would use the term street cred. So, it really is, they look now, these people, these nationalists look to Japan as they're the one that's going to lead them out of this mess that they're in. And they really, really believe this. Well, as soon as Burma becomes an independent country, Burma immediately declares war on the United States and Great Britain. And that's a bold move on his part, because you have to realize that Burma is right next to India, which is still controlled by the British, and the Indian army is relatively strong. And he's put his people on the front line. And he tells them this, that, we need to have our independence, and we are going to fight for our independence against the British. So he's taken a lot of risk here in order to declare war on the United States and Great Britain in 1943. But indeed, this is one of the countries that really is bought into being an ally, at least at the government level, not so much the military level, just so we know. But indeed, they are really involved with being a part of this. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Philippines. And the Philippines, certainly, the Japanese have a problem there. Remember, the Philippine army fought the Japanese invasion. The Philippines people do not particularly want to be part of Japan. The Philippine people have a very, very strong guerrilla movement. And the Japanese need to extract resources from this area, of course, like every area. And of course, they need to have less troop involvement. So instead, what's going on in the Philippines is they're constantly fighting Philippine guerrillas, which is tying up Japanese troops and assets that they could use in other places. So they need to find a way to get the Philippines under control. And they think by giving them indeed independence at this particular time, this will aid that situation. And then that brings up this gentleman, Jose P. Laurel. Some people will view him as a collaborator. Some people will just view him as a nationalist. I'm on the fence. I think I really kind of think he's just more of a nationalist. And as we have talked about, when the Philippines are about to fall to the Japanese in 1942, Douglas MacArthur gets on a PT boat and goes to Australia, leaving the island of Corregidor. At the same time, the government of the Philippines has left as well. And that government is under a man called President Quezon, and they will form a new government, a government in exile in the United States, much like the Dutch form a government in exile in Great Britain. But he tells Laurel, Quezon does, he goes, I need someone to stay behind and protect the Philippine people. And he chooses him because he thinks he's the most logical choice. And the simple reason is this is Laurel has a lot of connections to the Japanese. He has a lot of Japanese friends. His son actually goes to the Japanese version of West Point, the Japanese military academy. So he's very, very tied in with the Japanese in that regard. And he's still a nationalist, in my opinion. Well, Laurel starts getting fired up about this whole conference, and he's swept up, and he says 1 billion Orientals, 1 billion people of Greater East Asia. How could they have been dominated, a great portion of them, particularly by England and America? So even you see Laurel is starting to feel this surge of Pan-Asianism. Well, they're going to have this conference. And we talked about this, and there's going to, of course, be a joint declaration at the end of this conference. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing. Just quickly, though, they said at the top here, it is the basic principle for the establishment of world peace that nations of the world have each its proper place and enjoy prosperity in common through mutual aid and assistance. Notice that piece, their proper place. That ties in directly with the Japanese thinking of their co-prosperity sphere, that they are the head of the family of Asian nations. And they say this: the United States of America and the British Empire have, in seeking their own prosperity, oppressed other nations and peoples, especially in East Asia. They have indulged in insatiable aggression and exploitation and sought to satisfy their inordinate ambitions of enslaving the entire region. And finally, they came to menace seriously the stability of Asia. Herein lies the cause of the recent war. So the war is not the fault of Japan. The war is the fault of the United States and Great Britain. And then they go on to liberating the region from the yoke of British and American domination. That's the goal, that they are going to break Western imperialism. And finally, and I think this is really critical too, is the countries of Greater East Asia will cultivate friendly relations with all the countries of the world and work for the abolition of racial discrimination. They definitely realize that they've been discriminated against, and I certainly cannot argue with that. Okay, they have been discriminated against. But you see now that their goal for this conference is to unite Asia into a major force that will confront Western imperialism. Well, what's going on the other side of the world? The Allies are having a conference a couple of weeks later. And this conference will still be relevant today in our world. So they're going to have 3 of the 4 great powers there. It will be Great Britain, the United States, and China under Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. Stalin will not be there because Stalin is not at war with the Japanese because they had created a non-aggression pact in 1941. So he can't go. But they do have this meeting, and they're going to talk about many of the similar ideas, only with a significantly different spin than what's going on in Asia. And it's going to be a great moment for the Chinese and Chiang Kai-shek. So first of all, Roosevelt, who's really in charge of this thing, suggests that there should be 4 great policemen that will, I wouldn't say rule the world, but will maintain order in the world. And of course, that would be the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and China. So these 4 great policemen will maintain order. Well, also, he suggests that perhaps the Chinese should be in control of French Indochina. Now, I'm sure the French don't think much of that. But you notice that we don't see de Gaulle here because French Indochina is run by Vichy France. And we're not particularly, by this time, very fond of Vichy France, and as they are very closely associated with the Nazis. A huge problem for the French. But at this time, he suggests, Roosevelt says, hey, you know what? China should be in charge of this. And Chiang's like, I don't know. I think maybe that's a little bit more than we want to deal with right now. We've got a lot of other problems. And he kind of declines the offer. And Churchill is going to reluctantly agree with a lot of things that go on at this conference as well. And because Churchill doesn't really want to be necessarily have Asia for Asians. And so when we look at things, though, that occurred just previous to this meeting, in order to elevate Chiang to this level, the British and the United States have done some very key things. As we've talked about way back in this class, that the Chinese refer to this as the century of humiliation, that they have been forced to sign all these, what they refer to as unequal treaties. And these unequal treaties, of course, have allowed extraterritoriality. In other words, if I'm a white guy in my little area of China, I am not subject to Chinese law. I am subject only to laws that we control. So this allows for a lot of abuses to the Chinese people at this time. Again, why the Japanese feel that they're not really a sovereign country. So when we look at this, British is going to give this up. Not so sure they were going to give up Hong Kong. Not positive, because they did have a lease on that. But indeed, they're going to give up all these unequal treaties. So for the first time in 100 years, since 1842, China is now going to be recognized as a completely independent country by the West. And that's a huge, huge change for the Chinese. Well, we need to understand, though, what's going on at this time, that they've agreed to this, the British have, for China. They have not agreed to this for India, Burma, Malaya, etc. And simply this is they are still want to have a imperialist control of these areas that are so critical to the British nation to maintain their economy, for example. And Churchill's friend, Lord Moran, writes this in his diary. I think this is fun too. He goes to President Roosevelt, China means 400 million people who are going to count in the world of tomorrow. But Winston thinks only of the color of their skin. It is when he talks of India or China that you remember he is a Victorian. So indeed, Churchill is not 100% on board with this whole thing. Yes, Jim.
Where was Mao Zedong in this time frame?
We will get there.
Okay.
We got a long way to go before we get to Mao. Okay. So, but indeed, to your point, in a sense, this is the absolute height of power for Chiang Kai-shek. He is now at the table with Western leaders. He is an equal. China has become an equal in the eyes of the West. So we can see here that this is probably his bright, shining moment, okay? It doesn't really go well after this, but this is the big time for him. Well, there's going to be some agreements made at Cairo, and agreements that we live with today. And the first thing states that Japan will be stripped of all islands in the Pacific, which she has seized or occupied since the beginning of the First World War in 1914. So remember, Japan fought on the side of the Allies in World War I. And indeed, they were given all the German possessions in Asia that were north of the equator. That including key areas in China, the Marianas Islands, for example, etc. So that all went to Japan. That's going to be stripped. Then it says all the territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, including Manchuria, Formosa, and the Pescadores, shall be restored to the Republic of China. Japan will also be expelled from all of the territories which he has taken by violence and greed, and that in due course Korea shall become free and independent. Now, note that this says that they're going to give back everything to the Republic of China. That is still contentious today. All right. And I believe the piece for Korea is simply this. Because Stalin is not there, and Korea is basically borders Russia, that they don't want to make too big a statement here without Stalin being involved. So I think that's why we look at this as being a little bit. But again, the key piece is this still comes up today. This people, a few years ago, if you would ask people about, the Cairo Conference, they would have said, well, I don't know what that was. But nowadays, with the growth of China and China's military, and particularly some of their issues with Japan, this has become much, much more important. Well, according to FDR, Chiang is going to be the leader of Asia in the future. At the other conference, Tojo was going to be the leader of Asia in the future. So we can see that there's that juxtaposition here. And Chiang, though, because of his meeting and being a party to Western imperialism, remember, Chiang actually is in favor of free India. Don't get me wrong on this. But indeed, he's viewed by a lot of Asians as not an Asian. He's dealing with the West rather than overthrowing their oppressors. So indeed, he deserves compassionate killing. So we need to see that. I mean, it's like, so this is a great moment for China, though, that they've overcome the century of humiliation, that indeed they are now considered by the major powers in the world as an independent country. This is a great, great moment for China at this time. Well, yeah. So what's going on with the Japanese army? Remember, I said the Japanese army has a plan here that they need to create a victory to win the war. Because again, they don't really believe until really things don't get terribly bad for Japan until basically mid-1944. So early in 44, the Japanese still believe that they have a chance to win this war, or at least find some sort of settlement that would be agreeable to them. And they're going to try to find something in order to do that. Well, we're going to go back in time again, and we're going to talk about General Mutaguchi here. And in 42, some of his units had driven the British, the Indians, and the Chinese, and some American units out of Burma. And at that time, they were very ascendant. And the Japanese, some of the generals under Mutaguchi's command said, we need to continue to move into India. This is an opportunity because they're so weak. And we can break through into India. And Mutaguchi says, no. Train's too tough. We're already overextended. Our logistics aren't up to this. And indeed, we need to basically capture Burma, and then we'll go from there. So he basically asks his people, who are literally asking him to continue to advance into India, and he says no, because of logistics issues. Well, what happens then is in early 43, there's a British officer named Ord Wingate. And I think Wingate's one of those British-only characters. I mean, there's nobody, he wouldn't survive in the U.S. Army. Let's be honest about this. I'm not going to go into great detail about Ord, but look him up. He's... let's put it this way politely, he's different.
It is a very, very interesting character.
Very interesting character. Some would say crazy. But anyway, Ord has an idea. And what he's going to do is he's going to take small groups and use them on basically raiding missions into Burma, much like the Japanese army is structured, that they are basically going to be a light infantry force, and he's going to move through the Burmese mountains and jungles, and he's going to attack the Japanese in little groups. And there's no roads, so how is he going to be resupplied? Well, they're going to use air power. So basically, he would go to an area that's relatively flat, and he would radio in, say, we're here. And indeed, what happens then is they would drop supplies in via parachute to his unit to be resupplied as they continue to move through the Burmese jungle. And this absolutely enrages Mutaguchi. He's furious that this is a huge, huge embarrassment that these people are doing this in his area. And we need to talk a little bit about Mutaguchi. Now, you may remember, you go way back in this class, Mutaguchi was at the Marco Polo Bridge incident. And Mutaguchi, well, let's start a little bit. So remember, Iki was the subordinate of Mutaguchi. And Iki's unit is the one that the soldier disappeared, and they couldn't find him, and then there becomes a little skirmish with the Chinese at the Marco Polo Bridge incident. And Iki, of course, as we may remember, was killed at Guadalcanal. And Iki is trying to de-escalate the situation. Because, it's like, well, we got our guy back, everything's fine, don't worry about it. And Mutaguchi, on the other hand, starts to exacerbate the situation. He's going to use this as an opportunity. And he starts calling in artillery fire on the Chinese, and he creates such a big incident that Chiang Kai-shek sees this as Japanese major aggression, and indeed they could perhaps now take the city of Beijing, which is the last thing he can afford. And if they should take Beijing, of course, then that's going to put his government at huge risk. And so then he begins to exacerbate, and then indeed this leads to the start of World War II in Asia. Well, Mutaguchi is really proud of this. He takes full credit for he started the war. you know what, I did this for the benefit of Japan, and I did it on my own, and this is for the glory of the emperor. And you know what else? I'm destined to win the key battle that will win the war for Japan. Destined. He becomes actually messianic in this idea. Okay. Now, some of his peers and some of his superiors think, I don't know. I think this guy's a little funny in the head. And, but indeed, this is his idea. He's going to win the war because he's Mutaguchi. I guess that's the best way to put it. So now he comes up with a plan, and there's a two-part plan. It's going to be Hago and then you go. When we use the term go, that always means operation. So Hago is going to be the first part of this. And the idea is this is going to take place in an area of Burma known as Arakan. And this is going to be a diversion, and it's going to reduce forces for the main attack, which will be on the Imphal plain at the town of Imphal and Kohima. And the idea is simply this. They're trying to prevent the development of a thing called the Lido Road. And also what they're trying to do is they're trying to get India to revolt against the British. And if they can get that accomplished, they think this will be a huge peace in order to get that negotiated peace that they are so desperate to achieve. Remember, the longer the war goes on, the worse things get for Japan. So they need to get this. And this is the Japanese army's idea, and another major battle, which we'll talk about next week, to try to win this war. Well, that brings us to our good friend Subhas Chandra Bose. And remember, they've created this free India, Azad Hind, on these two little islands. And Bose is going to be in charge of this little piece. And we need to talk a little bit about him, because quite honestly, he's not exactly an unknown person. He's not some little party in India, okay? He's a major player. He was the president of the Indian National Congress from 38 to 39. So he's a major player in Indian politics. This is the Indian part of the government of India under British rule. And he's starting to get a little too strident about wanting to free India from British rule. He's starting to get a little too cozy with the Nazis, and the British decide, hey, we got to get rid of this guy. And indeed, he's forced to resign, and the British are going to arrest him. And what happens then is he escapes, and he makes his way through the Soviet Union to Germany. Now, remember, the Soviet Union at this time is not at war with Germany. And so he makes his way all the way to Germans, and the Germans somewhat embrace him. They think, yeah, we kind of like this guy. He's kind of a Nazi, And so while he's in Germany, he begins to have radio broadcasts that India needs to be freed from British rule. And then there's fighting in the African desert. We may remember Rommel in North Africa, and the British have brought in Indian troops. And many of those Indian troops are captured by the Germans. And he creates basically the Free India Legion. So he's got now 3,000 troops that he's convinced that they need to fight on the side of the Nazis to overthrow British rule of India. And then, as time goes on, he becomes more and more and more supportive of fascism. He believes actually that democracy is dead and he should be the ruler of India, a fascist ruler. Well, he can't do much when it comes to being in Germany. So he gets on a submarine and he sails to Singapore. Well, now he's in Singapore, and now he can do a lot more in order to aid the Japanese than he certainly could do in Germany with just basically radio broadcasts of 3,000 people. And so he begins to create a new Indian National Army. And as I've said, there were numerous expatriate Indians that lived in Malaya. There were many, many Indian soldiers that were captured by the Japanese in Singapore. And he starts to recruit these people and makes an army of about 43,000 men, so roughly 2 divisions. And the Japanese really can't afford to equip them. So what they do is they take arms they had captured at Singapore and begin to arm these people with British equipment. So, for example, they don't use the Arisaka rifle that the Japanese use, they use British Enfields. So basically, they're kind of poorly equipped. They're basically a light infantry force. They don't have a lot of heavy artillery, example. And they're not particularly well led because they're basically being led by politicians rather than professional military people. But they've become a key piece of what the Japanese are going to try to do in India. And the next piece is actually going to be almost comical. It's the best way I can put it. So try not to laugh too hard when I talk about what's going to go on with this. So he's in Singapore, Bose is, and Tojo goes to Singapore for a conference, and he meets up with Bose. And Bose starts telling him, hey, you know, if you support me and help me invade India, you know what? India is going to rise up against the British, and we're going to have India be part of the Japanese sphere of influence. In other words, we're going to join that co-prosperity sphere. And so then Bose goes away, and Tojo's aides come up to him and go, did you hear what that Bose guy said? And Tojo's like, well, not really. I don't really understand English very well. And quite honestly, I don't know what he was really talking about. And they said, well, he said this. He's like, if you help him invade India with his little army, indeed, the Indian people are going to rise up and they're going to throw off the yoke of British rule. And Tojo's thinking, hey, that's a pretty good idea. Okay, I kind of like that idea. And so he starts to become a proponent of Mutaguchi's Yugo plan. Well, the plan is simply this. There's going to be the Yugo and the Hago part. So the Hago part's going to come first. And the idea is they're going to have this fight in Arakan with one division, but the main battle is going to be up at the Imphal plain with Kohima and Imphal, and there's going to be 3 divisions. But one of those divisions will be able to use a road network, as we'll see. The other 2 divisions are going to have to go overland many miles without any particular support of road networks and resupply. The Japanese don't have the capability to use air power the way that the British can. Well, what his idea is they're going to basically, kind of like Genghis Khan, he's going to take animals and drive them through the jungle of Burma in order to feed his troops. Well, Genghis Khan had a big advantage because he was going through the plains and the steppes of and then on top of this, since they had no roads, they only can bring in light artillery, which I've shown you a picture of that little tiny Japanese cannon, which actually is relatively effective, but they're actually going to have their soldiers each carry an artillery shell on their back along with the rest of their packs. So again, it's a mighty thin logistics plan for a major assault into an enemy country. Well, the 3 division commanders are like, this isn't a really good plan. And basically, Mutaguchi's superiors are saying, this is pretty questionable. Well, Mutaguchi, what he's going to do is he's going to have to get the permission from Premier Tojo in Tokyo. And he sends an officer to go see Tojo. And he needs that so they can approve this plan, because basically a lot of people are not in favor of this. And what happens is when he sends that liaison officer to see Tojo, Tojo's in the bathtub. This guy kind of breaks into the house, and Tojo's in the bathtub, and he goes, hey, you know, we got this great plan, you know, and Tojo's first question is like, well, what are the logistics like? And the guy goes, oh, don't worry about the logistics. Everything's fine. This is going to work out great. And so Tojo's in the bathtub and thinking, okay, fine. I'm going to support this invasion of India. Again, it's really almost comical the way this goes out. So indeed, he approves the plan, and the Hago attack, the first part, is going to take place on February 5th of 1944. And hopefully this will separate India from Great Britain, and indeed, this will lead to a negotiated peace and a settlement that is palatable to the Japanese. Well, I've talked about Arakan, and we look at the map really quickly. You can see where Arakan is. Arakan is on the coastline. It's relatively developed compared to certainly the northern part of Burma, which is basically impassable. And this has been fought over previously. The British and Indians, for example, had launched a major assault in this area in early 1943, which was repulsed by the Japanese army. The British and Indians are planning to have another assault in this area in 1944, but they're going to be preempted by the Hago Plan. And the idea simply is this, is the British want to capture Rangoon. If they can capture Rangoon, they have a major port in this area. Of course, the Japanese want to defend that. And what's happening simply is there's roads, you can use the sea to transport goods. So this is a much more logical place to have a major assault. It's certainly better for your logistics capability. Well, the Japanese are actually going to preempt the British by launching this assault in Arakan. Remember, this is the first part of Mutaguchi's big plan. And so they are going to do that. And what they're going to do is they're going to have their 55th Division, the Japanese 55th Division, is going to basically sneak through the jungle and surround the Indian 7th Division in Arakan. And the idea, of course, has always been that once an Indian division, which is built in a Western style, in other words, they're used to having heavy logistics, they need a road network to be supplied, etc. Whereas Japanese are very much a light infantry force, they're much more capable of doing these kind of maneuvers. We've seen this in Malaya, we've seen this numerous times, that this is always the way the Japanese try to fight. And it's always been successful against Indians and British, because what happens is once they surround these units, the Indian units would break, abandon all their equipment, and basically run through the jungle and get away. And that's the expectation for the Japanese, that indeed, once they get behind that division, that division will break. Well, really what happens is the threat of the Japanese in the south expected the British to move forces away from their attack at Kohima. So simply this is, by attacking in Arakan with this 55th Division, they assume that when the 7th Indian Division breaks, the British will be forced to bring massive amounts of troops in to plug this gap, and that will reduce the amount of forces that will be up in the north at Kohima and Imphal, and that will aid their ability for their main attack to be a breakthrough. Again, this is a diversionary attack. So the Japanese do get the 55th Division behind the 7th Indian Division, and it's going quite well. And after a couple of days of fighting, they actually capture the command post of the 7th Division, and they're now going to be forced into an area that's referred to as the admin box. This is a relatively famous battle in British Indian Army history. But the British have given serious thought to this in the meantime. So they know that this has been the Japanese tactic, and they're going to begin to adapt their tactics to counter this. And indeed, they are going to do this. So what they tell the Indian 7th Division is to do this. They say, do not retreat. You're going to dig in. You're going to fortify your position on that road network. And indeed, what you're going to do then is we're going to resupply you by air. So we're going to drop in the equipment you need, and they actually have a small airstrip there as well. And we're going to bring in enough supplies by air for you to maintain your position. So do not retreat. And then we're going to do is we're going to bring in some additional forces to relieve you. And that's what they're going to do. So the British actually do send 2 divisions to break through to the 7th Indian Division that's been surrounded by the Japanese. So this has fallen directly into the Japanese, what they wanted. So now there's 2 divisions that would have been available to stop their main attack at Kohima and Imphal are now been sent down to Arakan. So things are looking sort of up for the Japanese here. Unfortunately, they have no logistics because this division hasn't broken and run away and opened up a road network for them and left them a bunch of supplies. They're surrounding this British unit, but indeed they have no supplies left. They're rapidly running out of forces. And so every day the British are becoming stronger and stronger, and the Indians are becoming stronger because of air support coming in and basically resupplying them. Well, this is a major shock to the Japanese, but they don't quite grasp it until later on. But I use this quote from General Achida. He's in charge of Burma at the end of the war. And he goes, Allied air supply, which permitted ground forces in Burma to consolidate their positions without being forced to retreat, and thus rendered the Japanese infiltration and encircling tactics abortive. So the British, with the use of cargo aircraft, have broken the code, if you'd like, of how to stop these Japanese infiltration tactics. He says this too. He goes, Allied air superiority, which so disrupted Japanese supply lines. This is attacking the Japanese with air power, both in Burma and further afield, that starvation and illness overtook thousands of Japanese troops facing 14th Army and denied them the essential supplies of fuel, equipment, and material with which to fight a better equipped and supplied Allied force. So air power is going to be absolutely critical in this front and again on the Asian mainland. Well, let us look at the Yugo part of this plan. We can see that Yugo is, Arakan is down at the lower center part there, and then you can see the two arrows up at the top. There should be three. I actually did fix that. But this is going to be the idea. This is where the main attack is going to take place. And so when we look at this, it's going to basically be the same idea. They're going to use these infiltration tactics. They're going to try to go through. Now, there's three parts to this. The southern part, and you can see on this map, it's a little hard to probably notice, but that little dotted line is road network. And you can see there's actually a road network that goes all the way up almost to China and then starts to head back down. That will be what's known as the Lido Road, which we'll talk about today. But the main piece here is the Japanese southern force, that southern division, has a road network. So it will have some heavy artillery, they'll have 95 tanks, and they're basically going to drive north. The center force is actually going to try to do something differently. They're trying to break in through the middle between Kohima and Imphal. And the idea with the second group is they're not going to be well supplied. They're basically bringing their supplies in on their backs, going through the jungle. But the idea is southern force is going to take Imphal from the south. The northern force is going to break through and isolate Imphal from the north. So that's the center group. Then we have the third group, and their goal is to capture the city of Kohima. And this is absolutely critical because Kohima is, again, part of that supply route into Imphal, but most importantly, it's a pass through the mountains that will lead into the plains of India. So that's the third piece. And again, these guys are going through the jungle, so they don't have any logistics. Well, the Japanese command still hasn't realized what's going on here, that the fact that these people can be resupplied by air is going to basically negate their tactics. And we'll see this particularly at Imphal. So another key piece, though, of this whole thing is the Indian National Army. The goal is that the Indian National Army will get the Indian people to rise up against the British. And that is probably the most important single piece involved with this as far as the Japanese thinking is. This is really the goal, is that they need to get the Indian people to throw out the British. Well, the Japanese want to disperse the Indian National Army throughout all their units, so there will always be people there to try to encourage the British to, or the Indians troops, excuse me, to encourage them to surrender and encourage them to join with this goal of freeing India from Britain. Well, Bose says no. No, I'm not going to use my troops that way. My troops are going to fight as a unit. Much like we see General Pershing in World War I with the United States, where the French wanted to parcel out United States troops to French units. And Pershing says, no, we're going to fight as an American army in France. Bose says the same thing. The Japanese really have no choice but to somewhat accept this. So there's still going to be some dispersion, but he's not going to break these units up as much as certainly they wanted to. And so what's going on is they're going to send part of one of these units into Arakan to try to help that breakthrough there and to get those Indians to surrender. They're going to send another group with what's known as the Yamamoto force. That's the force that's driving from the south to the north at Imphal that has artillery and tanks. And so they're going to be used in that group. And then you're going to have another major group that's going to go towards Kohima. And they are going to basically try to scout through the jungle and try to lead these Japanese troops where they need to be in order to fight this battle. So again, the Indian National Army is a critical part of how this is supposed to go down. Doesn't necessarily work out that way, but indeed, that's the idea. Yes.
I'm assuming there was some road system for those tanks to move across.
Yes, in the southern area, like I showed on that map, the little dots, there is indeed some road network. That's the Yamamoto force. So the Yamamoto force is much better supplied than the other two Japanese divisions that are moving completely overland towards Kohima and north of Imphal.
Was there any effort by the Allies to damage that road in any way?
Certainly. Absolutely. And we'll see that as we go along too. They're going to use air power for that purpose. Well, this picture just goes to show you kind of how intense that battle for Imphal actually was. This is brutal fighting. Well, what's going on is that the British have an idea and the Indians have an idea of what's going on, that there's going to be this attack. They're not completely oblivious to this, but they think they've got a significant amount of time before they need to really worry about it. So they haven't really consolidated themselves into very good defensive positions. Another key thing about this is we need to always remember that there was going to be a major offensive by the Indians and the Chinese in northern Burma at this time as well. So they're planning an offensive as well. The Japanese basically preempt that. So they're not quite where they need to be. And basically they think they've got a couple of weeks. They don't. And so that Yamamoto group I was talking about, that southern force, they make really good progress. They begin to drive up that road network and they get right in front of Imphal, right in front of the airfield. They don't capture the airfield. They're driven back by tanks and troops, particularly bloody fighting, and they take very, very heavy losses trying to capture that airfield. They do not do that. The northern force, actually the central force, they break through to that road network, and now they're going to become attacking Imphal from the north. So now they got the Yamamoto force in the south, the other central force in the north, and basically they've isolated the position at Imphal. But every day that the Japanese continue to fight, they become weaker and weaker and weaker. Well, what's going to happen? It's going to be like the admin box. The British are going to use that airfield in order to resupply and hold Imphal. And it's pretty amazing, really. And I really wanted to show you this particular aircraft. It's a C-46 Commando. It's not a particularly good aircraft, but it carries more cargo and more weight than the Douglas DC-3 or the more famous C-47. And so what has happened, of course, in Arakan is the Arakan force has failed. So they don't crush the 7th Division. And because they don't crush the 7th Division, the 2 divisions that were sent down there, one of them isn't actually necessary because the Japanese are defeated much sooner than they thought they were going to be. And so that makes this 5th Indian Division available. Problem is, how do you get this thing to Imphal? And what they're going to do is they're going to use aircraft. And so they're going to beg, borrow, and steal every aircraft they can get. And simply, we have a significant amount of forces or cargo aircraft that are flying supplies into China over what's known as the hump, the Himalaya Mountains. And the British go, hey, we really need some aircraft. So the US decides to temporarily suspend transport to China in order to support this mission for the British. And indeed, what happens then is we give them numerous C-47s to use and 30 of these C-46s. And they're going to be able to move the entire Indian 5th Division in 10 days, including light artillery and everything it needs to defend Imphal. It's pretty amazing that you could do that in 1944. But indeed, they move an entire division via air into this little tiny area and all the supplies they need. And of course, that's going to defeat the Japanese at Imphal.
C-46.
The C-46, I think, is a Curtiss aircraft. Was it a Douglas? I thought DC-3 is a Douglas, the C-47, but I think the C-46 is actually a Curtiss aircraft. I'll look that up. I'll try to tell you about it next week. But anyway, the British have total air superiority, to your point, and are beginning to interdict that road network. And so the Japanese are going to be thwarted in the Imphal attack, certainly by air power. Well, that leads us to the battle at Kohima. And indeed, this is really the key piece. This is where they would break through into that plain through this little mountain pass, and now they would have a definite road into India. And if they could capture, of course, all 3, they would have a road network going right in there. So this is really critical. And this is the best route into Burma or into India from Burma. So the Japanese 31st Division, that's the northern piece, they begin a 60-mile hike through the jungle. Again, driving their animals ahead and carrying their artillery shells on their back. And they run into an Indian parachute brigade. And that Indian parachute brigade is going to basically try to defend this area, but they're certainly overmatched, and the Japanese managed to drive them away. But now the British and the Indians realize that what's going on here is this isn't just attack by a regiment, this is an attack by an entire division. And now they need to start doing something really quick in this area, because there's a giant base at Dimapur. And the base at Dimapur is going to be used to continue to build that Lido Road, which we'll talk about shortly. And it's also going to be part of that offensive that they want to do in North Burma. And so if they can't lose Dimapur, that's be a disaster. But they're also in the problem is that it's going to be difficult to defend Kohima as well. There's only so many troops to go around. So all they can spare for Kohima is about 2,500 men, and 1,000 of those aren't combat troops. And they're going to fight very, very well. Let's put it bluntly. The British and Indians are going to be under siege, and literally they're fighting on each side of a tennis court. It's that tough of a battle. And indeed, what goes on here is that they can throw, it's like World War I, and this goes on for days. And of course, the Japanese are getting weaker and weaker because they're not being supplied. Well, eventually they take the tennis court. They take the surrounding buildings. But there's a key position called Garrison Hill, which they never take. So once again, the Japanese attack is failed. They are not going to be able to break into the Indian plain. Well, at this point, the 3 Japanese division commanders that were never in favor really of this assault in the first place begged Mutaguchi to end the offensive. That indeed this offensive has failed. Mutaguchi says, no, it hasn't. And he fires them one by one. as each one of them makes the case that they need to stop this offensive. Then he just fires them. Well, that doesn't work out particularly well because he's going to continue this fight on again with minimal supplies for 4 months. And by the end of this thing, they're faced with a massive British and Indian counterattack, and they have no choice to retreat. And they're so weak and suffering from disease that the Japanese basically abandon their equipment because they're basically too sick, too weak to even carry their equipment out. So it's a disaster for the Japanese army in this attempt to take India. And so total casualties for the Japanese at this time were about 57,000. Casualties for the Indian National Army are about 50%, so they lose over 20,000. So that unit never again is an effective fighting force. And of course, they didn't get the Indian troops to agree to defect. That failed. The Indian people indeed want independence, but they don't necessarily want independence from the Japanese. And so the British are going to lose about 12,000 men in this thing. And indeed, the Japanese army now is so badly damaged that they will never be able to launch a major offensive again in Burma for the rest of the war. So the goal of trying to enlist the Indians as part of this greater co-prosperity sphere has completely failed. And I think a lot of that, certainly, as I've mentioned, is to blame by the Japanese behavior of their exploitation policies of these nations. We will talk more about that certainly next week. Well, I like to look at this picture just so we get an idea of what the front looked like in China and Indochina at this particular time. And the dark brown area is going to be what the Japanese control up until 1944. And you can see in what we refer to as Vietnam, they control that, but it's not really connected. And you also see that the Japanese have total control of the coastline. And so this is critical for the Chinese. So basically this front is going to stay static because the Chinese are not getting supplied and they're basically significantly weakened. And we'll talk much more about that. But I really like to talk a little bit about Lend-Lease. And when we look at Lend-Lease, indeed, the vast majority of Lend-Lease is not going to China. Actually, we began to give Lend-Lease to China as early as May 6th of 1941. Actually, before we were in the war and before we were giving it to the Soviet Union. So China is really one of the first countries that we give Lend-Lease aid to. And the reason, of course, we're giving them Lend-Lease aid is because we want to keep the Japanese occupied. We do not want the Japanese to get involved with the European part of World War II. Of course, that fails. But that was the idea, that we would support China so that the Japanese would not fight with the British, the Dutch, and particularly later on with the Soviet Union. It's the last thing we wanted because, again, our policy is always Germany first. When we look at this pie chart, though, you can see the vast majority of Lend-Lease aid is going to the United Kingdom and the USSR. Up until June of 44, roughly a little more than 70%. Has gone to these two countries. When we look at, unfortunately, I couldn't find a chart that showed just China. So when you look at India and China, it looks like they're getting a relatively large amount of support. The vast, vast majority of that is not going to China, it's going to India, as we're going to see here as we continue on. And so the Chinese have been fighting since 1937. And they were able to be supplied up until 1942, really, through the Burma Road, through ports. Hong Kong, for example, is open, and they would get supplies of military equipment that way. Once the Japanese have captured the coastline, have captured Rangoon, all that comes to an end. So there is no way really to support the Chinese, and this makes the Chinese army. Remember, there's two pieces to the Chinese army. There's Mao Zedong up in the north southwest corner, and he's running a guerrilla army. They don't need that much stuff. You're a guerrilla at night. In the daytime, you go and you fight. At nighttime you fight, and then in the daytime you pretend to be a local peasant. So they're not built to have like heavy artillery and tanks and things like that. So they're not going to be effective against fighting the Japanese, full-scale Japanese war. Certainly they deter them, cause them problems, but they certainly aren't going to stand up and fight them. Mao's got that kind of an army. Chiang Kai-shek, on the other hand, has tried to build a regular type army, an army that depends on troops that are full-time soldiers, troops that have heavy equipment, etc. That's very, very difficult for him to maintain with as much as they've lost in China to the Japanese. They have very little revenue. They have very, very limited capacity to manufacture armaments. And perhaps most important is they're no longer able to receive armaments or lend-lease aid from the United States and Great Britain. So that's a problem for them. But still, when we look at China at this time, they are still holding down 600,000 Japanese troops. This is a huge aid to us. So as long as the nationalists stay in this fight, they're tying down a tremendous amount of Japanese fighting capability. So we need to really understand that piece, even though they're not as nearly as effective as they were in 1938 to 1940, for example. But they're still fighting on, which is pretty amazing, really. And so Japan controls the coastline. They can't get any lend-lease supplies in there. Everything has got to be flown in over the hump. And so basically the Chinese are only getting 0.5% of the totals up until right at the end of the war, only about 650,000 tons of supplies. That's a minuscule amount, what they need to maintain a modern army. And then when we really look at it, much of that isn't going to the Chinese army. It's going to support the United States Army Air Force that's fighting in China. So yes, the Army Air Force under Claire Chennault is indeed helping the Chinese fight this war. Don't get me wrong. But they're not bringing in supplies that are helping the Chinese army. They're bringing in supplies that are maintaining the Air Force. This will become particularly apparent with the B-29. So when the B-29 is going to be stationed in China, then even more aid goes in that doesn't go to the Chinese. It goes to support the B-29. And by the way, the Chinese peasants build the airfields for those aircraft. So that's another loss for the Chinese could have done to help themselves. Well, I use this one from Jay Taylor's book, The Generalissimo. And he says from 1942 to 1944, 98% of U.S. lend-lease to China went directly to U.S. Army units in China and not the Chinese military. I find that number to be perhaps a little inflated, but it was to Chiang's benefit to claim that, but certainly the vast majority is not going to the Chinese. It's going to support the U.S. Air Force. And I chose this aircraft. This is a C-109 tanker. It was built specifically to supply fuel to the B-29s in China. Only America could come up with an aircraft like has the capacity to build a couple of hundred aircraft just for one purpose like this. And they took a B-24 Liberator and turned it into a flying gas can. And it does have some problems. I don't want to go into it, but it's funny to me that we would just do that we had that much capacity. Well, I'm sorry? Yeah, that was Ford. Ford built the majority of B-24s. Yes, giant plant in Michigan. Well, this brings us to the Lido Road, and that's going to link India and China. This is an American idea. And by the way, the British don't want this. This is the last thing they want, is a road that leads from India into China. They're afraid that down the road that the Chinese will invade at some point into India. So they don't really want this road at all, but the America is going to drive this thing. And if you look at the map on the left side, you see where Lido is. That's the red circle. Then you see the yellow circle in the middle. That's called Mayakina. And then the oval, the blue oval, that's where the old Burma Road is. So the idea is that they're going to build a road through the mountains, get down to Mayakina, keep going south, connect up with the old Burma Road, and then they'll have a land route to take supplies into. Yes.
Looks like a certain street in San Francisco.
Well, we're going to get there. Okay, so yes, it does. It actually a lot worse. So when we look at this whole idea, though, we see that where, as Jim points out, what this road looks like when it goes through the mountains of Burma. That's not a particularly good road. Okay, it's not a particularly easy place to build a road. It's not a particularly effective road. In fact, it's basically, I guess I would use the word useless. But indeed, that's what we build. And today, that road is now known as the Stillwell Road. And we'll talk about Mr. Stillwell in great detail next week. And indeed, much of that road today is abandoned. And throughout, with this huge effort to build this thing, it only ever delivers 147,000 tons of supplies to China. So it's basically a complete waste of time. Well, that brings us to the siege of Mayakina. And simply this, it's in March of 44. And I've told you several times in this presentation that the British and the Americans and the Chinese wanted to launch an offensive in northern Burma. The reason is simply that they want to be able to finish building this road. In order to finish this road, they need to capture the city of Mayakina. And indeed, they're going to use something called X-Force. Now, X-Force is 2 Chinese divisions that Stillwell has built in India. Remember, when the Allies were driven out of Burma in 42, some Chinese units escaped into India rather than go back into China. They were cut off and went back westward. And so there were some Chinese troops there. And then as we have cargo planes landing in China with cargo on the way back, frequently they will fill these up with volunteer soldiers to become part of a U.S. trained and equipped 2 divisions, X-Force, in India. So he's been building this force of American trained and American armed Chinese troops. And they're going to be at basically by Lido. And this goal is to use this force to attack and capture this city. They have to capture Mayakina in order to continue building this road. Not a good road, but a road. And so this kind of bogs down. And it bogs down so much that now Stillwell, remember Stillwell, and we didn't really talk about this so far, but we'll get into more next week. Stillwell is basically in command of the U.S. forces in China and in India. And he's part of a thing called the Southeast Asian Command, which is actually under the British. And the Americans have a name for the Southeast Asian Command. They refer to it as Save England's Asian Colonies. But so there's a lot of friction here, let's put it that way. And Stillwell basically now demands that the Chinese, who desperately need troops, as we'll see, that they use the thing called Y-Force to help his invasion and open this Lido Road. Well, it doesn't go particularly well. And Chiang Kai-shek says, no, I can't spare these troops because I'm under pressure from an offensive called Ichigo, which we'll talk about in depth next week. And Stillwell demands that the Chinese help him capture northern Burma. He goes so far as to reach out to General Marshall in Washington, who's his close friend, and indeed reaches out to FDR. And FDR goes so far as to threaten China that he's going to cut off Lend-Lease aid if they don't help Stillwell attack in Burma. This is a major, major issue, certainly incredibly bad. And so this fighting goes on for months. And finally, Mayakina falls. But the Chinese Expeditionary Force and X-Force, Y and X-Force, are both basically destroyed. There's also a U.S. force here that you may be familiar with. Is called Merrill's Marauders. They actually make a movie about them. And they are tied up in this battle as well. And indeed, it doesn't go nearly as well as it should have. There's a lot of recrimination about Stilwell's handling of this battle. And basically, he's fought these units to exhaustion. Remember, they have the same kind of problems the Japanese have marching through the jungle. They're not supplied, they're not properly fed, and they're fought out. But eventually they do capture the city, and the Lido Road, even though it's never very useful, is indeed created. And with that, I hope to see all of you next week. We'll try to finish World War II. So thank you.